Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping right into something today that is absolutely going to challenge a massive assumption most of us hold about ourselves. We're talking about laziness. Or actually, we're talking about the argument that laziness doesn't even exist. Today, we're diving deep into the brilliant work of Dr. Devon Price, whose book basically completely shatters the idea that our value as human beings is tied to our output. We're going to break down the history, the very real human cost, and how Dr. Price suggests we can finally reclaim our worth in a culture that is just completely obsessed with the hustle. So let's get right into it. So tell me if this sounds familiar. Have you ever felt incredibly guilty just for sitting on the couch and resting? Because honestly, I know I have for sure. You finally get a spare moment to sit down, maybe you throw on a show or just stare at the ceiling for a bit, and instead of actually feeling relaxed, this creeping, heavy sense of inadequacy just washes right over you. You instantly start thinking about, the emails you haven't answered, the chores piling up, or that side hustle you really should be working on. Well, if you relate to that constant, exhausting guilt around simply taking a break, I want you to know you are definitely not alone. And according to the book, you're actually responding exactly how society has trained you to respond. Okay, so let's define what we're actually dealing with here. The core problem we're unpacking today is what Dr. Price calls the laziness lie. This is described as this incredibly false, insidious belief that our worth as human beings is entirely tied to our economic productivity and our output. It's literally that little voice in your head telling you that if you aren't actively doing something, you're worthless. But Dr. Price's central thesis is pretty earth-shattering. They argue that laziness is essentially just a social construct. It's not a biological reality at all. The book argues it's a completely made-up concept designed to make us feel bad for having basic, normal human limitations. And look, we didn't just wake up with hustle culture one random Tuesday. Dr. Price traces the historical roots of this concept and finds it deeply embedded in things like Puritan morality, where working yourself to the bone was literally seen as a sign of divine favor. Then, the author explains, this concept was heavily weaponized during slavery and periods of extreme labor exploitation to justify horrific treatment. Basically, if you weren't producing at maximum capacity, you were slapped with the lazy label. Finally, it evolved into our modern capitalist equations where labor is basically synonymous with virtue. The book argues that the whole stigma of laziness was systemically designed to control people, to extract labor, and to shame us, rather than being some objective, actual personal failing. Section 1. The human cost, when productivity becomes toxic. So our society absolutely loves to praise overwork. Hustle culture constantly glorifies exhaustion. We praise students for pulling all-nighters, we totally idolize CEOs who brag about sleeping 3 hours a night, and we reward people for sacrificing their physical health for a paycheck. But contrasting all of that hype is a very stark biological reality. This obsession leads directly to severe burnout, massive anxiety, and devastating illnesses. In fact, Dr. Price actually shares their own cautionary tale in the book, describing how chronic overwork led them to develop severe anemia and terrifying heart complications. The core argument here is that the human body literally can't sustain the demands of the laziness lie without eventually breaking down. Which brings us to a really fundamental biological truth that we almost always ignore. Quote, what society calls laziness is often the body's alarm system, demanding care. Honestly, let that sink in for a second. When you feel lazy, what's actually going on? Maybe you're processing trauma. Maybe you're just incredibly fatigued from a long week. Maybe you have unmet psychological or physical needs. The author suggests we label these very real, very human states as laziness, just to shame ourselves into pushing through the pain. But in reality, your body is simply sounding an alarm. It's asking for help. It is quite literally begging you for rest. But the laziness lie doesn't just mess with us on an individual level. Dr. Price argues that productivity is frequently used as a weapon, one that disproportionately harms marginalized communities. The book details how the lazy label is actively used to justify things like racism and sexism, basically painting certain groups with this brush to excuse deep-seated systemic inequality. And Price points out it is deeply, deeply rooted in ableism too. Think about how disabled people are so often accused of just not trying hard enough and are denied basic support simply because they don't fit the rigid capitalist mold of a productive worker. Price maintains that the laziness lie effectively sustains inequality by blaming individuals rather than acknowledging broken, unfair systems. And this brings us to a crucial turning point in our explainer, which is captured just perfectly by this quote from the phenomenal Black feminist thinker Audre Lorde. She wrote, caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. This right here is a massive paradigm shift. Rest is not some luxury reserved for when everything is done, because everything is never done. Acknowledging your limits isn't a weakness. When the entire world is constantly demanding your unbroken labor, choosing to simply rest is framed here as a radical act of resistance. Section 2. Radical Rest. Reclaiming your humanity. Okay, so how do we actually do this? Well, Dr. Price offers some highly actionable strategies to help us start detaching our self-worth from this need for constant output. Step 1. Start paying attention. Grab a journal and write down the exact moments when you feel that rest-induced guilt we talked about at the beginning. You have to bring the subconscious into the conscious. Step 2. Change your internal script. When you catch yourself thinking, I didn't do enough today, reframe it immediately to, I did what I could today. The book highlights this as a small, simple change that has a massive psychological impact. And finally, step 3, establish firm boundaries. Practice saying no, and here's the key, doing it without apologizing. For instance, dropping a class or saying no to an extra project at work to protect your mental health isn't lazy. The author argues it is actually incredibly wise. And what is the actual result of applying those steps? Well, a life beyond the lie is slower, it's way more humane, and it's infinitely more joyful. Dr. Price shares this incredibly inspiring example in the text of a worker who finally gathered the courage to leave a deeply toxic, high-pressure job. And instead of jumping right back into the corporate grind like society tells us to, they engaged in community gardening. They intentionally stepped back from the relentless pursuit of productivity as their entire identity, and in doing so, they found genuine, profound fulfillment. That is exactly the joy the book suggests is waiting for us on the other side of the laziness lie. But look, breaking free isn't just a solo mission. Dr. Price emphasizes that it genuinely requires collective liberation. If we want a healthy society, the argument goes, we have to demand a broader cultural change. We need to start collectively valuing care work, emotional labor, and actual guilt-free leisure. We have to normalize rest in our society. And there are already some amazing movements out there doing this exact work, like the Nap Ministry, which brilliantly frames resting as a collective spiritual practice. Overcoming the laziness lie is a deeply personal journey, yes, but Price argues it is also an absolute political necessity if we want to build a better world. So, the absolutely crucial takeaway from all of this is right here. Self-worth must be grounded in being, not doing. You are valuable simply because you exist, because you are human. You are not a machine. You are not a human doing. You are a human being. Rejecting hustle culture creates the necessary space for actual compassion, true creativity, and genuine well-being. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. The next time your body sounds the alarm and begs you for a break, are you going to shame yourself with the lie of laziness, or will you choose right then and there to reclaim your humanity and just rest? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will catch you all next time.